Once in a while, I'll play with a racket that absolutely blows me away. It happened with the Head Gravity Tour when I first tested it back in 2019. It was a similar experience with the Head Gravity Pro from that year, and the same thing just happened with this brand new Tecnifibre T-Fight 305S. Now, I'm obviously very happy when this happens, but it's also easy for me to get carried away. I like it so much that I think it's perfect, but as a reviewer, I need to take a step back and analyze it as objectively as possible. You see, rackets like this T-Fight, the Gravity Tour, they suit my playstyle and preferences almost perfectly, so it makes sense that I like them, but that doesn't mean that they're going to work for everyone. Still, I am going to say a lot of good things about this new T-Fight today, and honestly, that's because it's an absolutely phenomenal stick. Tecnifibre has been really close to releasing an all-time great racket in the T-Fight in the last couple of years, and this might be the one that finally does it for me, so let's get into it. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. So as you can tell, I'm pretty excited for this review. I've been a huge fan of T-Fight 305s in the past. This is one of my favorite rackets ever, and this is a really impressive update on the last few versions. Tecnifibre have gone for a lot of changes, not just new technology like we see from some other brands, and they've actually done a really impressive job of explaining those changes. If you go on their website, you'll see a ton of detail about the research and development that went into redeveloping this racket. They explain that obviously tennis has sped up a lot in recent years and that pro player rackets are going down in weight and up in power, and that's exactly what they targeted with this one. As you can tell from my excitement, they've done a pretty good job with it, and we'll get into a ton of detail about all that, but I just have to say, I'm pretty impressed with the way they've gone about this. It's pretty rare to see that much detail and explanation about the R&D process, so good job, Tecnifibre. Now, if you do go check out that website and you're convinced to buy the racket, remember to leave that website, go to racketsandrunners.ca, and that's where you should buy the racket. Sorry, Tecnifibre, but yeah, you can check out the T-Fight or any of the rackets we talk about here on our website, and also please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me in the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. So before we talk about the changes, I quickly want to go over the specs that haven't changed coming from the previous one. This is still a 305 gram racket with a 98 square inch head size, an 18 by 19 string pattern, and a constant 22.5 millimeter beam. Now, like I said, lots of changes, but the biggest and probably the most important is that they've actually changed this racket's balance point, and with that, they've also lowered the swing weight. The last T-Fights had always been a little bit more head heavy than the average 305 gram racket. The previous one had a 32.5 centimeter balance, and they brought it back towards the handle by a full centimeter to 31.5 on this one. This is more in line with the average 305 nowadays. It's the same balance as the Aero 98 and the E-Zone 98, but like I said, they've kept the static weight the same. That means they've redistributed weight from the hoop to the handle, which brings the swing weight way down from 336 on the previous one to 321 on this new one. Now that's interesting because to me, T-Fights have always had high swing weights. That's just part of their playability, and I thought that was a big part of the reason for why they were so stable. The problem with a high swing weight and a less head-like balance is that it makes the racket much harder to swing, and older T-Fights definitely had that kind of clunky hammer-like feel to them. Well, Tecnifibre aren't stupid. They know that rock-solid stable feel is the T-Fight's main selling point, so to keep that same stability at that lower swing weight, they've actually changed the frame's design. They widened the frame, not thickened it, still that same 22.5 millimeters the way we're used to measuring a frame, but they've widened it by 4% horizontally. A wider beam does a similar thing that a thicker beam would do. It makes it more powerful and more resilient on off-center hits, aka it makes it more stable and it makes the sweet spot a little bit bigger as well. I know 4% doesn't sound like a lot, but I can tell you right now, stability is incredible here. So they definitely did something right, although it is worth noting that this new design also makes this frame a little bit stiffer. I measured these both unstrung. The previous one came in at 63 RA. The new one was all the way up at 66, so it's definitely not a soft racket, and I'll talk about that more later on. So a change in balance, a change in frame design, and because of that, a change in stiffness. The next thing I want to talk about is technology, or should I say a lack of technology. You see, every brand is trying to lower swing weights and keep stability high. That's not some sort of new wild concept that Tecnifibre came up with, but other brands are doing it with these layup technologies like we see in the Blade, the CX, and the E-Zone. These layups work well. They expand the sweet spot so much that these rackets do become more stable, but they also create this ambiguous, slightly artificial or mushy feel on contact. There's no new technology in the T-Fight. It has ISOFlex, which keeps the frame a little bit more sturdy when you make contact outside the sweet spot, and it's still foam filled, but Isoflex and foam were both there on the previous one. That T-Fight had absolutely incredible feel. I know not everyone's a fan of foam, but I really like how solid it makes a racket feel, and I know it does mute vibrations a little bit, but it doesn't take away from your connection to the ball the way those modern layup technologies do. So no new technology that could hurt the feel, a much more manageable balance and swing weight, and a slightly reworked frame design to try and maintain that incredible stability. It all sounds great on paper, and now let's talk about if it actually works. Before we talk about how the new one plays, I just quickly want to give you the spark notes on the previous one because it was a pretty special racket and people who used it absolutely loved it. This was a ridiculously stable racket. That's what it's always been with the T-Fights. They feel like pro rackets where there's no cap to their playability. They're rock solid no matter the pace of play. With that rock solid stability also came an impressive amount of power, and then it had this semi-elliptical, semi-box beam design that Tecnifibre calls the RS beam. The box part of the beam provides a little bit more of that traditional controlled feel, and then the elliptical part of the beam is what gives it more of that modern rigidity, so plenty of power for a 98 and a solid amount of control. This also had a wonderful feel on contact. Again, it's foam filled, so keep that in mind if you don't like foam, but it had this very clean, solid, and really connected feel for the ball. The major issue with this racket, and there was really no way around this, is that it was hard to use. It had that pretty clunky balance and hefty swing weight that I mentioned earlier, and it's the type of racket that you had to swing fast to get the most out of it, and yeah, it's pretty hard to swing fast, so just a tough racket to use. What I was most curious with this new one was, did they keep that magical feel? Did they keep that magical stability? And have they managed to make it easier to use? And the answer to all those questions is yes. The most obvious thing that you notice right away is that this is a much, much faster racket. Lowering that swing weight by 15 points makes it go from one of the hardest 98s to play to pretty much on par with most players' rackets. Now, it does still have a slightly thicker beam than average for this head size, and keep in mind the beam did get a little wider as well, so it's not a fast racket, but that major issue of sluggishness is gone. That's pretty wild, because every time I played with the old T-Fight, I kept telling myself, if this was more maneuverable, this would be one of the most popular rackets in the world, and they checked that box off perfectly. Now, if you lower swing weight and keep all other things equal, you're going to make the racket less stable, but that's not the case here. This racket is extremely stable, and that's thanks to this wider beam profile. I was going back and forth between the two, and I can't tell you which one feels more stable. Both are rock solid, both feel like they get better and better the harder you hit, and that's absolutely crazy when you consider how much more maneuverable the new one is. So the same stability and more maneuverability, that means this racket is more user-friendly and just as forgiving on off-center hits, which makes it more accessible in general. Pretty awesome, and Beckett from Tencom did a great review with some cool charts detailing that literal off-the-charts stability to maneuverability ratio, so go check that out. But yeah, they accomplished something pretty special here. The one thing I will say is that this new one is noticeably stiffer, and that's a byproduct of this wider beam design. It does feel a little bit more rigid on contact, and whether you like that or not is up to you. I tend to prefer a firmer feel like this, although keep in mind we're up into the mid-60s for stiffness, so comfort could become an issue for some of you. There's not a ton of dampening in here. The foam does take away some vibrations, but it doesn't really soften up that impact the way these more modern dampening technologies do. Just be careful with your string setup. If you've never had any issues with discomfort, you should be fine with pretty much anything. For those of you who are a little bit more sensitive, don't go higher than 53 with a stiff string. With a soft string, you could pretty much do anything. It's not uncomfortable, I want to make that abundantly clear, but it is a little bit stiffer than the previous one, and T-Fights don't really have that noodly flex in general, so yeah, I wouldn't call it a comfortable racket. Now let's talk a little bit more in detail about that feel, because like I said, it was exceptional on the previous T-Fight, and they didn't change anything here in the layup, so is it as good? Yes. The feel on this T-Fight is at least as good as it was on the previous one, which to me is really what elevates this frame into a special category of rackets. There are a lot of 98s that are becoming more maneuverable, more user-friendly, and more stable at low swing weights, but a lot of those have been sacrificing feel to get there. Achieving that easier, faster playability without sacrificing feel is extremely impressive. I want to make that as clear as possible, and Tecnifibre should be very, very proud that they've done that. Now the feel is different, no doubt about that. Remember, it has a different beam, so you would expect that. And the way I would describe it is that it's still super connected with that typical foam feel, but it's just a little bit crisper and cleaner all around the string bed. If I were to nitpick one little issue I had on the previous one, it's that when you made contact outside the sweet spot, it had a tendency to feel a little bit hollow and tinny. On the new one, you still get that incredible feel when you make good contact, but you get slightly better feedback when you hit outside the sweet spot, which helps make it more forgiving, and I think that just helps the whole feel experience in general. So this is an impressive racket. They set out to make big changes to an already great frame and knocked it out of the park. They managed to combine that holy trifecta of feel, stability, and maneuverability. Stability is what's going to give high-level players so much confidence with this frame. Good feel adds to that confidence because it makes you more connected to the ball, and it also makes hitting with this a heck of a lot of fun. The fact that they've added maneuverability into that mix is a game changer because it opens it up to a lot more players since it's an easier racket to use, and for advanced players, it means they can generate a lot more swing speed for power and spin. Now, before I talk about how these updates have changed the power profile here, first I want to remind you about what I said earlier. The previous T-Fight was a very powerful racket. I know it's a constant beam 98 with a pretty tight string pattern, but this is definitely more powerful than it looks. It's not one of those soft, buttery, traditional control frames. It pops the ball off a little bit harder because of that semi-elliptical beam shape. Now with the wider beam, the stiffer flex, and the more forgiving feel, this new T-Fight is even more inherently powerful than the previous one, both in terms of easy depth and top-end power. It's got a ton of pop off the string bed, it crushes into the ball, and what I really like is that it just gets better and better the harder you and your opponent are hitting. This racket's ability to redirect pace is really quite phenomenal, and that's one of those characteristics that good players absolutely love because that means it has no ceiling to its playability. So it's more inherently powerful, but beyond that, because the swing weight is so much lower, the way you generate power is different. Quick little physics lesson. Force, which we're going to call power in this case, equals mass times acceleration. You can generate power with lots of mass and less acceleration, or lots of acceleration and less mass. The way modern tennis is evolving, players want more acceleration, less mass. The problem is, if you go too low in swing weight, you end up with not enough weight behind the ball, and the racket becomes flimsy, so you can swing as hard as you want, you won't get any power. What they've done here is create a racket that still feels incredibly solid at a lower swing weight, so you can accelerate the racket faster, and you've still got plenty of mass behind the ball. The last T-Fight was more the type of racket that generated a lot of power, but it was more the mass of the frame doing a lot of the work as it came through contact. This new one is more powerful in the sense that you can swing it faster, which is more along the lines of what the modern player wants. This was probably my favorite update to this racket. You can see with a lot of these clips that I'm generating a ton of racket head speed, which isn't something I could consistently do with the last few T-Fights. When I was really on top of my game, they were fine, but when I was late to the ball or I wasn't playing my best on a certain day, I'd start letting the frame do the work for me because it was just so heavy. Now to those super high level players who say, well, I don't have a problem with a high 330 swing weight. In fact, I prefer that. Well, great. You're so incredibly amazing at tennis. I'm sorry us mere mortals can't compete. Just kidding. That's a perfectly reasonable question. And the good news is you can just add weight to the hoop to customize it up to that spec, and you'll end up with even more power than the previous one because of the frame's new design. Really, a lot of what I just said for power applies to spin as well. With this lower swing weight and more head-light balance, you can generate easier racket head speed, so you have easier access to spin. The one thing I will say is that there is something pretty special about rackets with a more head-heavy balance point when it comes to spin generation. There's a reason why the Pure Aero Rafa, both the 290 and the Origin, have such a high balance point. If you're still able to get that windshield wiper motion going with a racket that has a lot of weight concentrated up there, you're going to generate a ton of spin. If you've used older T-Fights, you'll know that they're kind of ridiculously spin friendly considering they have fairly thin beams and they're 18 mainers. And I think a lot of that came from the higher balance point and the higher swing weight. I don't think I'd say the new one is less spin friendly because it is easier to generate racket head speed, but you do lose a bit of that unique spin friendly feel that you got on the previous ones. That's really a small price to pay. It kind of goes hand in hand with what I was talking about in the power section. It's you, the player, who's going to generate more of the effect on the ball with swing speed rather than the mass of the racket that's going to do it for you. Now there is one thing I want to clarify with this frame because I've said this and I think some other reviewers have as well. This has a serious amount of spin considering its specs, but it's not spin like true spin rackets. It responds with a ton of spin when you're swinging big with a fast and full stroke, and that's where it's so outstanding considering it has 18 mains. But when you slow it down, things get a little bit tougher. This isn't a racket that likes hitting slow, high margin, loopy spin balls like an E-Zone or an Extreme Pro. there isn't enough string movement here for the racket to respond well to those types of shots. There's not much spin tech here. These grommets are actually super traditional and tight. There's nothing in this racket's layup to generate more snapback. And yeah, it is still an 18 mainer, so there's not a ton of easy spin here, but when you're swinging big, swinging fast, it will produce a very modern spinny ball. Now we have to talk about control with this frame, because when you see its specs, you automatically think it's going to be a pure control racket, which in some ways it is, but not to the same extent as the most control-oriented frames on the market. This is a super accurate racket in terms of directional control. That means the ball is going to go where you tell it to every single time. It has pinpoint precision that's up there with the very best point-and-shoot rackets on the market right now, so you can pick your spots with a ton of confidence, and that's obviously something that high-level players really appreciate. That's also a big part of the magic with this racket. You have laser-like accuracy and stability with power, which is a pretty rare combination. There are two other rackets that stand out for me as exceptional at those three things: the RF01 Pro and the Babolat Pure Aero 98. The RF01 Pro is a little bit different. It's a much harder racket to use because it has quite a small sweet spot, but this and the Aero 98 share a lot of similarities. I know it sounds weird, but I can't stop comparing them every time I play. This is so powerful, so stable, and so precise, and it has that really high spin potential when you're hitting big, which obviously the Aero has as well. For me, these are really the two rackets that are at the top of the game for 98 square inch frames in terms of variety and a super high playability ceiling. So control is excellent in terms of precision and accuracy, but like I said in the power section, this does generate a lot of depth, not in a wild or surprising way, but you can't just whack at the ball and hope it's going to stay in. For those of you who play a really flat counter-punchy style, slowing the racket down, letting the ball sink into the strings and guiding it back into play, this is not going to be the best racket for you. Especially now that it has a wider beam and a firmer feel, this racket doesn't really soak up the ball the way those buttery soft control frames do. This is more of an instantaneous, super responsive frame. The ball's in and out of the string bed, which is part of why it's so powerful, but to control this, you either need to be hitting on the rise and flat, or if you're trying to hit with margin, you want to add some spin. Now, I did say in the spin section that this is a tough racket to slow things down with and hit with spin, so maybe you're thinking no slow flat shots, no slow spin shots. Is there no slow shot here? And yeah, that's probably the main, I guess, quote-unquote issue with this racket. This is an incredible racket, but you always need to be swinging it fast to get the most out of it. So it's definitely made more for higher level intermediates and advanced players who can consistently generate a lot of racket head speed. It's funny, the more I talk about this racket, the more I think it's the most pro-coated racket I've tested in a very long time, or at least up there with the Gravity Pro. It's a typical player's racket in that it's ridiculously solid and just gets better and better the harder you hit. But if you've read anything the pros are saying the last few months, they want more power. This is probably the most powerful racket that feels this solid, this stable, that has this laser-like precision and confidence-inducing control. And on top of that, it has that pure foam-filled feel that we know pros love. I can't emphasize enough how impressive it is that they also lowered the swing weight by this much and kept literally every other part of what made the T-Fight line so special over the last several years. It's awesome because the 335 swing weight is too high for like 75% of players, but bringing it down to the low 320s means that pretty much anyone can at least try and play their best tennis with it. Kind of pulling those numbers out of nowhere, but they make sense in my head. So yeah, a lot more players can at least try it, but like I said, it is a little bit harder to use, so it's not going to be for everyone. Remember, the big thing with this racket is that you need to generate racket head speed. If you do, you're rewarded with power, spin, and control, which is obviously pretty awesome, and the fact that racket head speed has gotten so much easier to generate kind of makes this the perfect update. I really hope that people give this racket a shot. I don't know if it's going to take over the Blade and the E-Zone in terms of popularity for 98s, because it is still a little bit harder to use, but this racket ticks every single one of the boxes you want to play good tennis. It also has something that I haven't explicitly talked about, but you can probably tell with my excitement. There's a real fun factor to this racket. When you hit with a frame that's so unique but also works so well, that's pretty cool. And when you add to that the fact that it has that really addictive feel, well, you have all the ingredients for a racket that makes tennis incredibly fun. That's what this is for me. It's a fun racket, but also a racket with ridiculously good playability. Now we just got to get Tecnifibre to stop with this grip shape. I mean, seriously, I'm not trying to offend the TK82 people, but this isn't it in 2025. This is not it. I probably should have mentioned it earlier, but yeah, they keep going with this oval grip, that same grip shape that Head used to use in all their rackets, the TK82 I just referred to, and I'm just not a big fan of it. If you like it, great, but I thought this was going to be the racket where they finally switched to something a little bit more modern. But hey, if you hate it, there are ways of changing your grip shape. Maybe I can make a video on that. But yeah, As you can probably tell, I am a huge fan of this racket. I've been using it for a while. I'm starting to move better on court with it. This thing has literally healed me. That's how good it is. But yeah, I'm definitely going to keep one in my bag for a while. Maybe in a few months I'll circle back and see if it really does live up to the title of this video, but honestly, I think it might. This thing is pretty special. But anyways, that is going to be the end of this review. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that if you do want to demo this T-Fight or any other racket, you can come visit us in store, or you can check it out online at racketsandrunners.ca.